The alarm clock buzzed at 5 in the morning, but Harold Matthews was already awake. He had been lying in his small bed for the past hour, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the day ahead. His weathered hands reached over to turn off the alarm before it could wake his neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who lived in the flat next door. At 89 years old, Harold still lived alone in his tiny one-bedroom apartment in the village of Whitby in Yorkshire. The walls were covered with old black and white photographs from his time in the war and medals that had been gathering dust for decades. Harold slowly sat up on the edge of his bed and looked at the special clothes he had laid out the night before. His old dark blue suit that he only wore to church and funerals was hanging on the back of his bedroom door. Next to it was his most treasured possession, his military beret from World War II. The fabric was faded and worn, but it still held the same pride it did when he first put it on as a young soldier 78 years ago. Harold picked up the beret and held it in his shaking hands. He could still remember the day his commanding officer had handed it to him at the training camp in Dover. The old veteran made his way to the small kitchen and put the kettle on for his morning tea. While he waited for the water to boil, he opened the kitchen window and looked out at the quiet village street. It was still dark outside, and the streetlights were casting long shadows on the empty road. Harold had lived in this same flat for 45 years, after he returned from working in London. He never married and had no children of his own, but his neighbors had become like family to him over the years. Mrs. Peterson often brought him homemade soup, and Mr. Collins from downstairs helped him with his shopping when his legs were too painful to walk to the market. The kettle whistled, and Harold made his tea with 2 sugars, just like he had done every morning for as long as he could remember. He sat at his small kitchen table and opened the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago. It was from his nephew Michael, who lived in London with his wife and 2 young children. Michael had written to invite Harold to stay with them for a few days and to fulfill his lifelong dream of seeing the changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Harold had talked about wanting to see the ceremony for decades, but had never found the courage or energy to make the trip to London. Michael was the son of Harold's younger sister, Mary, who had died 5 years ago from cancer. Before Mary passed away, she had made Michael promise to take care of Harold and to make sure he was not forgotten. Michael was a good man who worked as a teacher at a primary school in South London. He had grown up listening to Harold's stories about the war and had always looked up to his uncle as a hero. Michael knew that Harold was getting older and that this might be his last chance to see the ceremony that meant so much to him. Harold read the letter again for the 100th time since it had arrived. Michael had written that he would drive up from London to collect Harold and that they would stay in his house for 3 days. On the 2nd day, they would go to Buckingham Palace to watch the ceremony, and Michael would make sure Harold had the best view possible. The letter was written in Michael's careful handwriting, and Harold could feel the love and respect in every word. He had finally written back 2 weeks ago to accept the invitation. As Harold finished his tea, he thought about all the reasons why he wanted to see the ceremony. During the war, he had served with the Yorkshire Regiment and had fought in France, Belgium, and Germany. He had seen things that no young man should ever have to see, and had lost friends who were closer to him than brothers. Harold had been at the liberation of several concentration camps and had helped to free thousands of prisoners who were barely alive. The memories still haunted him in his dreams, but he had learned to live with them over the years. Harold had always believed that the haunted him in his dreams, but he had learned to live with them over the years. Harold had always believed that the Royal Guards represented everything that he and his fellow soldiers had fought to protect during the war. The ceremony was a symbol of the freedom and democracy that they had risked their lives to defend. He had watched the ceremony on television many times over the years, but he knew that seeing it in person would be completely different. Harold wanted to stand in the same place where thousands of other veterans had stood before him, and to pay his respects to the young men and women who continued to serve their country. The old veteran got dressed slowly, putting on his best shirt and tie before carefully placing his military beret on his head. He looked at himself in the mirror and could see the reflection of the young soldier he used to be. Harold had been tall and strong when he joined the army at 18 years old. Now he was bent over with age and needed a walking stick to get around, but his eyes still held the same determination and pride that had carried him through the darkest days of the war. Harold packed a small bag with his few belongings and his most important documents, including his military records and medals. He wanted to bring them with him to London, even though he knew he would not need them for the ceremony. They were proof of his service and sacrifice, and he never traveled anywhere without them. Harold also packed the letters that his fellow soldiers had written to their families before they died in battle. He had been carrying these letters for over 70 years and had never been able to find the courage to deliver them to the families. By 7 o'clock, Harold was ready and waiting by his front window for Michael to arrive. He could see the sun starting to rise over the village, and he felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness about the journey ahead. Harold had not been to London for over 20 years, and he knew that the city would have changed dramatically since his last visit. He was worried about the crowds and the noise, but he was determined not to let his fears stop him from achieving his dream. At exactly 8 o'clock, Michael's car pulled up outside Harold's building. Harold could see his nephew getting out of the car and walking towards the front door. Michael was a tall man in his 40s with kind eyes and a gentle smile that reminded Harold of his sister Mary. Harold took one last look around his small flat and picked up his walking stick and his bag. He knew that this journey would be one of the most important trips of his life, and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Michael knocked gently on Harold's door and waited for his uncle to answer. When the door opened, Michael was struck by how smart Harold looked in his best suit and military beret. The old man's eyes were bright with excitement, and Michael could see that this trip meant everything to him. Harold had always been like a father figure to Michael, especially after his own father had died when he was just 12 years old. Michael remembered spending summer holidays at Harold's flat, listening to stories about the war and learning about courage and sacrifice from a man who had lived through history. The drive from Yorkshire to London took almost 4 hours, with several stops along the way for Harold to stretch his legs and rest. Michael had brought a thermos of tea and some sandwiches that his wife Sarah had made for the journey. Harold sat in the passenger seat, looking out at the countryside as they drove south. He pointed out places where he had stationed during his training and told Michael stories about his fellow soldiers that he had never shared before. Michael listened carefully to every word, knowing that these memories were precious and that Harold might not have many more opportunities to share them. As they got closer to London, Harold became quieter and more thoughtful. The traffic was getting heavier, and the buildings were getting taller and more modern than anything Harold remembered from his previous visits to the city. Michael could see that his uncle was feeling overwhelmed by all the changes, but he tried to keep the conversation light and reassuring. Michael had planned the trip carefully and had made sure that they would have plenty of time to rest before the ceremony the next day. They arrived at Michael's house in South London just after lunchtime. It was a small terraced house with a neat front garden and a red front door. Michael's wife Sarah came out to greet them with their 2 children, Emma, who was 8 years old, and James, who was 6. The children had heard many stories about their great-uncle Harold, but they had never met him before. Sarah had prepared a special lunch and had decorated the guest bedroom with flowers and photographs of Harold's military unit that Michael had found in old family albums. Harold was touched by the warm welcome and the effort that the family had made to make him feel at home. He sat in Michael's living room and looked at the photographs on the walls. There were pictures of Michael's wedding, the children's school sports days, and family holidays at the seaside. Harold felt a pang of sadness as he realized how much family life he had missed by never marrying or having children of his own. But he was grateful to be included in this family and to see how well his nephew had turned out. After lunch, Sarah showed Harold to his room and left him to rest while she took the children to the park. Harold lay down on the comfortable bed and closed his eyes but found that he could not sleep. His mind was full of thoughts about the ceremony tomorrow and what it would mean to him. Harold had been dreaming about this moment for so many years that he was almost afraid it would not live up to his expectations. He worried that he might become too emotional or that his health might let him down at the crucial moment. That evening the family sat around the dinner table and Harold told Emma and James stories about his time in the army. The children listened with wide eyes as their great-uncle described the places he had been and the things he had seen. Harold was careful to keep the stories appropriate for young ears, but he wanted them to understand the importance of remembering history and honoring those who had served their country. Emma asked Harold why he had never gotten married, and Harold explained that the war had changed him in ways that made it difficult to settle down to a normal life. Michael had prepared a detailed plan for the next day's visit to Buckingham Palace. He had researched the best viewing spots and the timing of the ceremony to make sure that Harold would have the best possible experience. Michael had also brought a small folding chair in case Harold's legs became too tired to stand for the entire ceremony. He wanted everything to be perfect for his uncle, who had waited so long for this opportunity. Harold went to bed early that night, but again found it difficult to sleep. He lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the sounds of London outside his window. There were cars passing by, people talking as they walked home from the pub, and the distant sound of trains running through the night. Harold thought about all the other veterans who had made similar journeys to the capital over the years. He wondered how many of them were still alive and whether any of his old army friends would be at the ceremony tomorrow. The old veteran got up several times during the night to look out of the window at the city lights. London seemed so big and busy compared to his quiet village in Yorkshire. Harold felt like a small fish in a very large pond, but he was determined not to let his nervousness spoil the experience. He had survived much worse situations during the war, and he would not be defeated by a simple ceremony in his own country. As the first light of dawn appeared, Harold finally managed to fall asleep for a few hours. He dreamed about his army days and the friends he had lost in battle. In his dream, he was young again and marching with his unit through the streets of a French town that they had just liberated. The local people were cheering and throwing flowers, and Harold felt proud to be wearing his country's uniform. When he woke up, he could still hear the cheering in his ears, and for a moment he forgot where he was. Michael knocked on Harold's door at 7 o'clock with a cup of tea and some toast. Harold was already awake and had put on his best suit and military beret. He looked at himself in the mirror and straightened his shoulders, trying to recapture some of the military bearing he had possessed as a young soldier. Today was the day he had been waiting for, and nothing would stop him from honoring his fallen comrades and experiencing the ceremony that represented everything he had fought to protect during those dark years of war. Harold and Michael left the house at 9 o'clock in the morning to make sure they had plenty of time to reach Buckingham Palace before the ceremony began. Harold had insisted on carrying his own small bag, which contained his military medals and some old photographs of his army unit. Michael walked slowly beside his uncle, respecting the old man's determination to be independent, even though he could see that Harold was already tired from the effort of getting ready. The London Underground was busy with morning commuters and tourists heading to various destinations around the city. Harold held tightly to the handrail as they descended the stairs to the platform. He had not been on the Underground for many years and was surprised by how much it had changed. The trains were newer and cleaner than he remembered, but the tunnel still echoed with the same sounds that had provided shelter for thousands of Londoners during the Blitz. Harold remembered spending nights in these very tunnels as a young soldier on leave from training camp. As their train approached Westminster Station, Harold could feel his heart beating faster with anticipation. Michael noticed that his uncle's hands were shaking slightly, and he offered to carry Harold's bag, but the old veteran politely refused. Harold wanted to carry his own belongings to the ceremony as a matter of personal pride. He had been carrying the weight of his memories for almost 8 decades, and he was not about to let anyone else shoulder that burden now. When they emerged from the underground station, Harold was amazed by the crowds of people already making their way toward Buckingham Palace. There were families with young children, elderly couples taking photographs, and groups of tourists speaking in different languages from around the world. Harold realized that the ceremony attracted people from many countries who came to witness this famous British tradition. He felt proud that something from his homeland could bring so much joy and interest to visitors from faraway places. The walk from the station to the palace took longer than expected because of Harold's slow pace and the growing crowds. Michael had brought the small folding chair as planned, and he offered several times to set it up so Harold could rest. But the old veteran was determined to walk the entire distance on his own 2 feet. He said that his fallen comrades had marched much further distances in much worse conditions, and that he could manage a few city blocks in their honor. As they got closer to the palace, Harold could see the famous gates and the red uniformed guards standing at their posts. His eyes filled with tears as he realized that his dream was finally coming true after so many years of hoping and planning. Michael stayed close to his uncle, ready to offer support if needed, but also understanding that this was Harold's moment and that he needed to experience it in his own way. The area around the palace was packed with hundreds of spectators, all waiting for the ceremony to begin. Michael had researched the best viewing spots, and he guided Harold to a position near the front, where they would have a clear view of the proceedings. Harold was grateful for his nephew's careful planning, but he was also overwhelmed by the size of the crowd and the noise of so many people talking and laughing around them. An elderly woman standing next to Harold noticed his military beret and struck up a conversation about her own father, who had served in World War II. Harold listened politely to her stories, but found it difficult to concentrate on anything other than the guards who were beginning to take their positions for the ceremony. He had waited his entire adult life for this moment, and now that it was finally happening, he wanted to absorb every single detail. A young couple with a baby asked Harold about his military service, and he briefly explained that he had fought in France and Germany during the war. The couple thanked him for his service, and Harold felt touched by their recognition, even though he had never expected or sought praise for doing what he considered to be his duty. Harold had always believed that the real heroes were the men who never came home, and that survivors like himself were simply lucky to have lived long enough to grow old. Michael helped Harold move to a slightly better position where he could see more clearly without being blocked by taller people in front of them. Harold gripped his walking stick with one hand and placed his other hand over his heart as he watched the guards marching into formation. The precision and discipline of their movements reminded him of his own military training and the countless hours he had spent learning to march in perfect step with his fellow soldiers. The ceremony officially began with the sound of military bands playing traditional marches that Harold recognized from his army days. The music stirred something deep inside the old veteran, and he found himself standing straighter and holding his head higher despite the pain in his back and legs. Harold felt as though he was not just watching the ceremony, but was somehow participating in it as a representative of all the soldiers who had served before and after him. The famous red-coated guards began their intricate drill movements with clockwork precision. Harold watched every step and gesture with intense concentration, as if he was trying to memorize every moment for future reflection. He thought about his old army buddies who would have loved to see this display of military excellence and tradition. Harold whispered the names of some of his fallen friends under his breath as a way of including them in this special experience. Michael noticed that Harold was becoming emotional, and he placed a gentle hand on his uncle's shoulder to offer comfort and support. Harold appreciated the gesture, but he did not want to be distracted from the ceremony that was unfolding before his eyes. This was more than just a tourist attraction for Harold. It was a living symbol of the values and traditions that he had risked his life to defend during the darkest period of the 20th century. As the ceremony continued, Harold felt compelled to show his respect in the way that felt most natural to him. Without thinking about the crowd around him or the tourists taking photographs, Harold slowly raised his right hand to his forehead in a perfect military salute. His weathered fingers trembled slightly, but his gesture was firm and deliberate. Harold held the salute with dignity and pride, knowing that this was his way of honoring both the guards performing their duty and the memory of his comrades who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Guard Samuel Richardson had been standing at attention for almost an hour in the scorching London sun. The weight of his bearskin hat pressed down on his head, and sweat was beginning to run down his back beneath his thick red uniform. Samuel was 23 years old and had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 2 years. He had performed this ceremony hundreds of times, but today felt different somehow. The crowd seemed larger and more respectful than usual, and Samuel could sense an energy in the air that he had not experienced before. From his position, Samuel could see most of the spectators gathered behind the barriers. There were families taking photographs, tourists consulting their guidebooks, and children sitting on their parents' shoulders to get a better view. Samuel had been trained never to look directly at the crowd or to acknowledge individual members of the public in any way. His job was to remain perfectly still and focused, regardless of what was happening around him. The guards were expected to be like living statues representing the dignity and tradition of the British military. Samuel's eyes were fixed straight ahead, but his peripheral vision allowed him to notice movement and activity in the crowd. He had learned to block out most distractions during his training, but something kept drawing his attention to an elderly man standing near the front of the barriers. The old man was wearing a military beret and was standing straighter than most people. His age. Samuel could not turn his head to look directly, but he sensed that this man was different from the other spectators. The ceremony continued with its precise choreography, and Samuel moved through the familiar drill movements with automatic precision. His mind was trained to focus only on the task at hand, but he found himself thinking about his own grandfather, who had served in the Korean War. Samuel's grandfather had died when Samuel was 15 years old, but the old man had filled Samuel's childhood with stories about military service and the importance of honor and duty. It was these stories that had inspired Samuel to join the army and eventually become a Queen's Guard. As the ceremony reached its midpoint, Samuel noticed that the elderly man in the military beret had raised his hand in a perfect military salute. The gesture was so precise and respectful that Samuel felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat of the day. Samuel had seen many tourists attempt to salute during ceremonies, but this was different. This salute came from someone who clearly understood its meaning and significance. Samuel could see that the old man's hand was shaking slightly, but his posture remained proud and dignified. Samuel's training told him to ignore the salute and continue with his duties, but his heart was telling him something completely different. He recognized the look in the old man's eyes, even though he could only glimpse it from the corner of his vision. It was the same expression he had seen in photographs of his grandfather and other veterans from past wars. It was a look that spoke of sacrifice, loss, and unwavering dedication to something greater than oneself. The internal struggle within Samuel intensified as he tried to decide what to do. Every fiber of his military training screamed at him to maintain his position and ignore the crowd. Breaking protocol during a ceremony was one of the most serious offenses a guard could commit and could result in immediate dismissal from his position. Samuel had worked too hard and come too far to throw away his career on an impulse. But as he continued to catch glimpses of the elderly veteran's respectful salute, Samuel felt that following the rules might mean missing an opportunity to do something truly meaningful. Samuel thought about all the stories his grandfather had told him about the bonds between soldiers across different generations and conflicts. His grandfather had always said that military service created a brotherhood that transcended time and rank. Samuel wondered if his grandfather would understand, if he broke protocol to acknowledge a fellow veteran's respect. The ceremony was supposed to honor military tradition and service, but what was the point of that tradition if it prevented him from showing respect to someone who had actually lived and fought for those very ideals? The crowd around the elderly veteran seemed to be noticing his emotional response to the ceremony. Samuel could see people taking photographs and pointing in the old man's direction, but the veteran appeared completely focused on the ceremony itself and seemed unaware of the attention he was attracting. His salute remained steady, and his eyes were fixed on the guards with an intensity that Samuel had rarely seen from spectators. Samuel's commanding officer was standing nearby, but was facing in a different direction and could not see what Samuel was seeing. The other guards were maintaining their positions and following protocol exactly as they had been trained. Samuel knew that if he chose to acknowledge the veteran's salute, he would be acting entirely on his own initiative and would have to face the consequences alone. But as he watched the old man continue to hold his respectful position, Samuel felt that some things were more important than rules and regulations. The moment of decision arrived faster than Samuel had expected. The elderly veteran's salute had lasted for several minutes and showed no sign of wavering despite the obvious physical strain it was causing him. Samuel could see that the old man's arm was trembling with the effort, but his determination remained unshaken. In that instant, Samuel made a choice that would change both of their lives forever. Against every regulation he had ever learned, and despite the potential consequences to his career, Samuel slowly turned his head toward the elderly veteran. Movement was deliberate and unmistakable, and Samuel knew there would be no way to pretend it had been accidental. As his eyes met those of the old veteran, Samuel raised his own hand in a crisp military salute that acknowledged not just the man standing before him, but all the veterans who had served their country with honor and courage. The salute lasted only a few seconds, but those moments seemed to stretch into eternity. Samuel felt a connection to something larger than himself, and larger than the ceremony he was performing. He was participating in a moment of recognition and respect that transcended military hierarchy and spoke to the fundamental bonds that unite all those who have worn their country's uniform. When Samuel finally lowered his hand and returned to his position, he knew that he had just experienced one of the most meaningful moments of his military career, regardless of what punishment might follow. The moment Samuel returned Harold's salute, a gasp of surprise rippled through the crowd like a wave hitting the shore. Dozens of people who had been watching the ceremony suddenly realized they had witnessed something extraordinary. Cameras that had been casually recording the traditional ceremony were now focused intently on the exchange between the young guard and the elderly veteran. Harold felt his knees buckle slightly as the emotion of receiving the unexpected honor overwhelmed him, and Michael quickly steadied his uncle while trying to process what had just happened. Harold's eyes filled with tears as he slowly lowered his trembling hand from his forehead. In that brief moment of recognition from the young guard, Harold felt that all the years of carrying his memories alone had finally been acknowledged. The gesture meant more to him than any medal or official ceremony could have, because it came from the heart of a fellow soldier who understood the weight of service and sacrifice. Harold had not expected anything from his visit to the palace except the chance to pay his respects, but he had received something far more valuable. The crowd around Harold began to realize that they had witnessed something special, and many people started to applaud quietly. An elderly woman standing nearby had tears in her eyes, and she reached out to touch Harold's arm in a gesture of shared emotion. A young father lifted his son onto his shoulders and explained to the boy that he had just seen something that showed the true meaning of honor and respect. Harold felt embarrassed by the attention, but also deeply moved by the response of the people around him. Michael was amazed by what his uncle had just experienced, and he felt proud to have been part of this incredible moment. He had brought Harold to London hoping to fulfill an old man's dream, but he had never imagined that the trip would result in such a powerful exchange of respect between two generations of soldiers. Michael could see that Harold was struggling to remain standing, and he suggested that they find a quiet place where his uncle could sit down and recover from the overwhelming experience. As Harold and Michael made their way through the crowd, several people stopped them to thank Harold for his service and to tell him how moved they had been by what they had witnessed. A tourist from Germany shook Harold's hand and explained in broken English that his own grandfather had been a soldier in World War II and would have been honored to meet a veteran like Harold. A young woman from Australia asked if she could take a photograph with Harold, and he politely agreed while still trying to understand what had just happened to him. Meanwhile, Samuel was trying to concentrate on finishing the ceremony, but his mind kept returning to the moment when he had looked into the elderly veteran's eyes. Samuel knew that he had broken one of the most important rules in the Guard's handbook, and that there would likely be consequences for his actions. His commanding officer had noticed the unusual movement and was already making notes that would probably result in Samuel being called in for questioning after the ceremony ended. The remainder of the ceremony passed in a blur for both Harold and Samuel. Harold found a bench where he could sit and watch the final movements of the Guards, while Michael stayed close to make sure his uncle was not overwhelmed by well-wishers and curious onlookers. Samuel completed his duties with professional precision, but he felt different inside, knowing that he had chosen to follow his conscience rather than blindly obey regulations. He did not regret his decision, regardless of what punishment might follow. After the ceremony ended, Harold and Michael walked slowly back toward the underground station. Harold was exhausted from the emotional intensity of the morning, but he also felt a sense of completion that he had not experienced in decades. The simple gesture from the young guard had somehow lifted a burden that Harold had been carrying since the end of the war. He felt that his fallen comrades had finally been properly honored, and that his own service had been recognized by someone who understood its true meaning. On the train back to Michael's house, Harold was quiet and thoughtful. Michael could see that his uncle was processing what had happened, and he did not want to interrupt the old man's reflections with unnecessary conversation. Harold stared out the window at the London suburbs passing by and thought about how one moment of human connection had transformed what could have been just another tourist experience into something profoundly meaningful. That evening, Harold called his neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, back in Yorkshire, to tell her about his day. He described the ceremony and the crowds, but when he tried to explain what had happened when the guard saluted him, Harold found that words were not adequate to capture the emotion of the experience. Mrs. Peterson could hear the change in Harold's voice, and she knew that something important had happened to her old friend during his trip to London. Over the following days, photographs and videos of the exchange between Harold and Samuel began to appear on social media and news websites around the world. Someone in the crowd had captured the moment perfectly, and the image of the elderly veteran and the young guard saluting each other became a symbol of respect and remembrance that resonated with people everywhere. Harold was amazed to learn that his simple act of paying respects had touched so many lives and had reminded people of the importance of honoring those who serve their country. Samuel did face questioning from his superiors about his breach of protocol, but the response was not what he had expected. Instead of punishment, Samuel found himself being praised for his compassion and judgment. His commanding officer explained that while rules and regulations were important, the Guard's ultimate purpose was to honor military tradition and service. Samuel's gesture had done more to uphold those values than years of rigid adherence to protocol could have achieved. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Harold received a letter from Buckingham Palace inviting him to return for a private meeting with senior officials who wanted to formally recognize his wartime service. Harold was overwhelmed by the unexpected honor, and he called Michael immediately to share the news. The simple trip to watch a ceremony had somehow grown into something much larger and more significant than either of them could have imagined. Harold kept the newspaper clippings and printed photographs from that day in a special folder along with his military medals and documents. Whenever he felt lonely or forgotten, he would look at the pictures and remember the moment when a young soldier had chosen to honor him and all the veterans who had served before. The memory of that salute would stay with Harold for the rest of his life as proof that sacrifice and service are never truly forgotten by those who understand their true value.